Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Thank you. Let's start, continue. We had discussed key exchange, Diffie-Hellman algorithm. We looked at public key and private key cryptography. Now we look at how these can be used primarily. Authentication, we'll discuss, and then we look at the digital signature. So, what does authentication really mean? Again, good amount of material I had taken from textbook one. So acknowledging the same because the recommended textbook is still very superficial and you may find it little difficult to read and understand and hence I'm still following material from textbook one which is lot more useful. Textbook in the syllabus we have an algorithm called SHA1. Secure has algorithm. Again the description in the textbook is abstract. So I had taken the help of URL which gives you nicely an example with some examples. So I recommend you to go through this URL and you'll probably understand how does the secure hash algorithm really works. So what does authentication gives us? Authentication basically means verify a person. We could be verifying a sender or we could verify a receiver or maybe even both. When we access, let's say, https colon google.com, does the browser authenticate the web server or does the web server authenticate the user at the web browser? Any thoughts? So let me repeat the question. When we type https colon google.com or https colon yahoo.com or whatever the site, now is there authentication involved? And if so, does the browser authenticate the web server or does web server authenticate the browser or does each other authenticate each one or no authentication? Nikhil BS, Karthik, Nikita,
Yes, sir.
do you know the question? What a question I ask you?
So TCP handshake,
No,
three-way handshake.
what is my question?
So the you authentication from the browser and the user side.
Yeah, so who does what? So I'm not talking about TCP here. Question is when you open
HTTP.
the browser, type https colon google.com, is there any authentication involved? And if so, who authenticates whom?
So I don't think there is any authentication.
There is authentication.
Sir, both the web server, and the web browser authenticate each other, sir.
That is not true.
So only the server will authenticate.
The web browser?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
No,
Web
that is
browser.
not true. So what is the answer left?
Sir, using SSL, it will authenticate. So,
Yeah, but who? I mean, SSL is used, but who's authenticating whom? SSL is not for authentication. SSL is for confidentiality. I said there's authentication involved. I said web server does not authenticate a browser. So then who is authenticating whom?
User is authenticating the web browser.
No. web browser is authenticating a web server. And if you type HTTP, there is no authentication involved. Let me quickly give an example. Let me open a browser. Let's say Firefox. Okay. And let's say what is Google's IP address. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
So this is the Google IP address 172.217.160.174. I'll type HTTP, we'll get a web page. No issue. Fine. I'll type same thing, HTTPS. Do you think I'll get a web page or will I get something else?
Sir, we'll get the web page.
Let's see what you get. What happened?
The server is not secure.
No, it's not a question of secure. Essentially, what has happened is web browser is trying to authenticate. When you do HTTPS, web browser trying to authenticate a server. Server sends a certificate saying this is IM, and server certificate contains the website name as google.com. But browser said I entered 172.217.160.174, but certificate name contains google.com. Browser says, look, I entered this name, but certificate name is different. Two does not match. That means there's just some goof up. Something is wrong. And that's why browser gives you a warning. So it is the browser that is authenticating a web server. If web server need to authenticate it, either you should put a personal certificate or they normally ask you username password. Only then you get an Gmail, not otherwise. So in this case, browser authenticating a web server. When you access, let's say, a phone in a 2G network, it is only the carrier by connecting to you authenticates the user. But user never authenticates that the network I'm connecting to is genuine or fake. But in 3G network, both authenticate each other. What is to understand we're doing? When you go to an ATM machine, you never authenticate is the machine genuine or somebody put a fake machine. But ATM machine always authenticates you because they look at you, enter your PIN number on the card. My PIN number is valid, only then you are able to work. So ATM or the bank authenticates you with a PIN number. We need to understand how authentications primarily work. So basically verifying. Now, if a sending data message authentication could be two things. One is identify the content of the message, which to me belongs to integrity of the message. And so actually authenticity of the sender of the message, that message comes from who's sending it and not from somebody else. Message content authentication mostly to me is integrity, but that's what the book says, so I'm producing that. To me technically is incorrect. Content authentication means you are doing integrity. You do implement by hash function, and we'll study that in a short while. Authentication of sender is required. You use either digital signature. That is what we will study tomorrow, and other things. So let's go through basic issue in authentication, and then we'll look at what are the authentication messages or what mechanism is used to make sure authentication works. One is simple case. We start with simplistic case to make it complicated to understand why authentication becomes complicated. Alice is communicating with Bob. Bob wants to be sure that I'm talking to Alice, not somebody else. So maybe Bob asks, please identify who are you. And he says, I'm Alice speaking. And Bob says, oh, okay, is Alice? That's fine. You basically know who is Alice. Simple case, if everybody is trustworthy, nobody is cheating, this is great. But if there is an attacker in between, attacker can see this packet and then play this packet saying, I am Alice. And Bob has no way to figure out whether it was Alice or whether it was an attacker. Now, so how we can improve? Next step is Bob possibly knows the IP address of Alice. And so Bob wants Alice to authenticate. Alice sends a message, I am Alice, and this is my IP address. Bob says, okay, this coming from right IP address must be Alice, and accept the message and whatever Alice says. Can this still fail? Can attacker play mischief?
No, sir.
Why not? Attacker can send a packet using Alice IP address and saying, I am Alice. And Bob has no way to figure out. And so you have problem there. Okay, you want to put one more level of security. Let's go to the third stage. And assuming they share a password, so Alice puts her password into the message, and Bob says, no, only Alice can know the password, and accepts. Can this also fail? Can attacker capture this message and send it again, replay? So the message is going clearly. You can read the password, send it, and then this again fails. Okay. Now we would say, okay, because password is in clear text, so let's encrypt the password. So Alice sends her IP address, encrypted password, says Alice. Can this attack still fail? Nikita,
Yes, sir.
can this
So,
attack, can attacker still work?
sir, if the password can be decrypted, yes,
No,
sir.
password
Then,
is not decrypted. Attacker doesn't know the key.
yes, sir.
So
Then no.
attacker cannot decrypt the password.
No, sir. Then the attacker cannot.
But what happens if attacker sends the same message? Attacker doesn't have to know the password, but attacker knows what the encrypted password is, and attacker sends the same encrypted password. When Bob decrypts, he says the password is correct. So without knowing a password, Alice can still send the message. So even this won't work.
How, sir? How can attacker know the password, sir?
I'm on the network. Do a
Unique,
capture,
right?
look at what the packets are going. I can capture the packet and send it again.
Okay, everything is visible and they can
Yeah,
read it.
network, everything is visible. I mean,
Okay.
encrypted. So my password is hello, but encrypted would be XYPQ12P, whatever some junk.
Yes.
I can read those junk and send it. I do not know the password, but I can still transmit it. No?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So attacker can still work. So what do you do? To understand the challenges when you bring in authentication from simplistic case to more complicated. So Bob want to make sure that it is Alice and nobody else. So what Bob does is when Alice said, primarily want to avoid the playback attack. because attacker can capture the packet and subsequently can play the same packet. And Bob would have no way to figure out what is happening. So what Bob does is, when Alice says, I am Alice, Bob says, okay, I need a little more verification. I and you share the same secret. We have a shared secret. So I'm sending you a number R. And then Alice encrypt the number R with the shared secret and send it out. So Alice says, I am Alice. Bob says, hold on. Bob gives a number. This is called a challenge. So this kind of protocol is called challenge response protocol. So Bob gives a number to Alice, says, you know we have the common shared secret using your keys. Please encrypt this and send it using a shared secret. Alice sends it. Bob can decrypt it. If it matches with, after decryption, if it matches with the number R, that means it's coming from Alice. If it does not match, then it is not coming from Alice. Can this still fail? Can attacker still play the magic and goof or play havoc? Is it possible? Every time Alice wants to converse, Bob will always send us some new number. So can attacker still play with it? Guys, give a thought.
Sir, if another
Yeah.
So the attacker might modify R and send it to Alice.
If attacker modifies R, that can happen perfectly fine. So what Alice will do will encrypt the, so let's say attacker modifies R and Alice get R prime. Fair enough? Then Alice will encrypt R prime. When the Bob decrypts R prime, he will get R prime and not the R. And R will not match with R prime. So he says it is not the Alice. Or something has gone wrong.
Yes, sir. Or the attacker might, modify the message after decrypting.
Attacker will modify with what? Attacker doesn't know the key. Attacker
Sir,
can send some other message. Yeah, go ahead.
if the attacker sends R instead of Bob, then won't he get to know the key, shared
No.
key?
No.
Because
See, what is happening? Look at. Alice is encrypting R with the shared key, and key is known to Alice and Bob only. Attacker doesn't know the key. If attacker sends R, Alice will decrypt it.
yes, sir. Got it, sir.
So, question is, can this still fail? How this can fail? Answer is it can fail. The chances
Sir-
are very less, but it can. I want you to think how it can fail.
So maybe when Bob fails to recognize Alice in the first place.
How? See, Bob is basically his blood message. Bob is sending the, let's say this is called, you give a username. Bob says, I'm giving you a number. You have a shared secret, encrypt it. Bob gets the encrypted value. Now Bob decrypts the encrypted value, compares with the original value. If the two matches, then it knows it's coming from Alice. The two does not match, then it's not coming from Alice. And this protocol mechanism is called challenge handshake protocol. Protocol by itself works. There are no issues there. Nobody can play havoc per se and modify message. But there are other issues. Let's say one time attacker will not work. But attacker is monitoring this conversation for last, let's say, 1 year. Okay. And it's capturing everything. If some point in time, Bob happened to send the same R which is used earlier, then attacker can play havoc. Because the attacker knows for this R, this was the encrypted key. So every time Bob sends a R, attacker checks, is it one of the previously used R or a new R? If it is a new R, it keeps in storage. The moment it gets previously used R, because some point in time R is going to be replayed. R is a random number. The moment attacker sees it is the same R which was used 3 months ago, then the message doesn't go to Alice. Attacker simply sends the encrypted value because it has stored previously encrypted value and Bob doesn't know. So attacker, without knowing the key, is still able to fool Bob because of it has observed for large number of periods. So if Bob can ensure that R is always unique, if Bob can ensure R is always unique, attacker cannot play havoc. But if at any point in time, due to randomization, if R is reused, then this could be subject to attack. Are we clear here?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So how do we proceed? Now you know what challenges are. So we basically want to make sure that anytime such thing happens, authentication should be successful. And typically that is done using what is called hash functions. When we talk about authentication signatures and we'll know how they are used. It's a complicated affair. And again, I'm trying to give you a lot more details. Even the textbook, if I need to cover, I could have covered the whole chapter by yesterday. But I'm trying to give you gist of what security means so that you can really understand. To achieve authentication by using hash functions. What is a hash function? Given the data, you perform some hash and get some small value. You all studied Java and you know how hash works. When you do the map or the keys. You have a hash map, weak hash map, so always have a number and look at that part. So there are two hash functions. One is called MD5. It always gives you 128-bit message digest. And the only thing is, given any arbitrary message digest, some value, you should not be able to find a message whose MD5 sum comes to X. Basically means, given a hash value, I should not be able to find a message with the same hash value. Because if I can find, then I can corrupt the message. In general, this works, but this seems to have been broken by brute force. In today's computing power, MD5 can be broken. Thus, MD5 is no more used for authentication purposes, not in a strong system. Weaker system will still be fine. Other one has function is called SHA-1. Secure hash algorithm is actually SHA when it started by NIST. But then later on, it found to be little compromisable. So they increased the key size. SHA-1 basically uses 160-bit message digest. And now then we have SHA 256-bit message digest and 512 and even larger. Anything less than 512 2024 with today's computing power is a question mark. And what is being predicted is the moment quantum computing takes shape. Because with quantum computing, the computing power would go way too high by order of magnitude. And all of this security which depends upon computationally infeasible, meaning you cannot compute in a given possible time, in a given lifetime. So if to using a brute force, if a normal supercomputer, a normal computer today, if it takes me million years, with quantum computing, I might do in a day. And that's the power quantum computing will give you. And that means entire security has to be looked at, a new mechanism has to be used. So what is secure today may not be secure tomorrow because of the new technology that comes in. So let us look at what are the requirements of message authentication, how does it do, and then we discuss SHA-1 algorithm. So typically what a sender does, take the message, apply the hash function, and generate a hash value which is called a fingerprint. And attach the hash value at the end of the message and transmit the message. What does receiver do? Receiver get the message, receiver also get the message digest or a hash value. Receiver recomputes the hash value and check if message is corrupted or not. And if it computes the same hash value, it knows message is not corrupted. If hash value is different, message is corrupted. This only verifies the message is corrupted or not, but assuming that nobody has done deliberately. Like if you look at this kind of things, when you do the IP messages, IP protocol, we have a what is called CRC or checksum. TCP, we have a checksum. We have a message and the checksum. And we know we've seen that UDP, even checksum could be, by adding characters could be done. So it only sees if by erroneous media something has been corrupted. So it is not more, so unless if you simply attaching hash value, this does not give any security. Attacker can change the message, can compute the hash value, update the hash value and send it. Receiver wouldn't know. But at least the mechanism is when we have a message, we have a hash value, something has to be encrypted. If the plain text, there's not a security there. But let's look at what is the requirement for a hash function and how does security really gets it. So one key objective of hash function is it is a one-way affair. Meaning you have a message, you convert a send a hash value, and from a hash value you don't have to construct back the original message. You're only verifying. So it is not an encryption, it's some kind of encoding, you can say that you're not converting it back. In encryption, you need to decrypt. In the hashing, there is no decryption. It's only one-way affair. So because it's one-way affair, I can do any complicated part and doesn't have to worry about it. It may be easier to verify. So typically, whenever user receives the message, it recomputes the hash and compares with the encrypted value what it has received. If two matches is fine. If two doesn't match, that some message has been corrupted. Other requirement of hash function is given the message digest. For given a message digest, I should not be able to reconstruct a message M. So that is another requirement. Third requirement is given message M, so hash function is known. We know what hash function is. Given the message M, we know what is the hash of M, which is M1. So given a message M1, we should not be able to find a message M2 such that two hashes are same. And we have seen that in internet checksum, this miserably fails. Like in UDP, if I were to append UQ in the beginning of the message, we get the same checksum. So for any given message, we can find another message. It would just simple checksum. So checksum is not a great hash function because P3 is very much violated. Even P2 could be violated. Given a checksum, I can always find a message which gives me same checksum. So both P2 and P3 are violated if you are using checksum. So in general, in security transmission, checksum is not used, and we use a better hash function. So in message authentications, typically two approaches. One is that when we generate a hash, you encrypt the hash with a key. So you transmit the message and transmit the encrypted hash value, which we call message digest. Receiver receives the message. Receiver also receives the encrypted message digest. But using the received message, receiver does hash function on the received message, compute the checksum, compute the hash value. Receiver got the message digest. Receiver has received the encrypted message digest. So receiver decrypts the message digest, compares with the hash, and then if the two are same, then it knows message is correct, otherwise it has been played with. Other is we do not do any encryption because encryption is a costly affair. So how do we do? So this is what we have seen in OSPF protocol. We have a message, but what receiver does, receiver sends the message and receiver sends a hash function. But while computing a hash function, what sender does, he takes the message, appends this message with the shared secret between the two people. So sender takes the original message, append the shared secret to the message, and then compute the checksum. And the sender sends the message and sends the hash function value. Sender is not sending the shared secret. So what sender is doing? Taken the message, append shared secret to the message, and then compute the hash function, and then send the message and the hash value. Shared secret is known only to the sender and receiver. Attacker can read the message, can alter the message. Attacker knows the hash function algorithm, but attacker doesn't know the shared secret. So if we place something else, transmit, things will not work. So what does receiver do? When receiver gets the message, receiver also appends the shared secret to the message and compute the hash value. And compare this received hash value with the hash value in the message. If the two matches, message is uncorrupted, otherwise message is corrupted. So if an attacker tries to change the message, it can change, but because it doesn't know the shared secret, it has to use its own shared secret, and thus the hash value would not work and to fail at the receiver. So one method is you encrypt the message digest or encrypt the hash value. Other is you do not encrypt the hash value, there's no encryption, but take the shared secret, append the shared secret to the message, apply the hash function and send it. So primarily hashing is involved. Whether we encrypt or not, that depends upon what kind of authentication we're trying to do. So this is the way authentication works, to verify the message content. Now we look at one algorithm which is called SHA-1 or originally called SHA. This is what is given in a book. Is again in a little crypto way, not completely given, but taken some material from the URL referred to and explain you. This is better than the MD5, which is used, first developed by National Institute of Standards and Technology in US. It works with messages of length 2 raised to power 24 bit, fairly large size messages. And it always produces a message digest of 160 bits. Now, below is the discussion of algorithm. And since this security has been added first time and it was not there in last batch, not there last batch, so you have to probably mug up the algorithm. There is no way you can probably do. Even though I don't like mugging up, but that's the choice. You have to, if the exam comes, you probably have to mug up the algorithm. The way algorithm works is the following. The number of steps, 6 steps. First step is initialize 5 registers or 5 temporary variables, whatever you want to call them. And these variables are assigned a value. You don't have to remember the values. Book doesn't talk about these values, but I'm giving you values from the standards. So you can just say initialize 5 registers as per the value defined in SSA1 standard. After that, you need to pad the message. Message has to be padded in such a way that it should end with length of 448 bits modulo 512. So let's say message length original is 300 bits, then you add 148 bit to it. Let's say message length is 800 bits. So modulo 5 would give you, modulo 512 of 800 would give you 288. So you add 160 to it to make it, so last chunk you always pad with to make sure that the last chunk has the length of 448 bits. And how do you pad? To the message, append first bit as 1 and remaining all bits as 0 till the length becomes 448 bits. This is crucial. So take the message, look at the last chunk, and make it the length of 448, append 1, number of zeros, and then you get the message. So this is what you get. So chunk becomes 512 bits. Then you look at the length of the original message. It's going to be less than 64 bits. If it is more, then use the last 64 bits and append that length in bits to this. When you append 448 plus 64, the length, total length of the chunk becomes 512 bits. So basically, SH algorithm works in the chunks of 512 bits. So all the full message has become now 512 bits. Now take each chunk and repeat the following process. Divide each chunk into 16 words. And each word is 32 bits. So 16 chunks, call them M0, M1, M2 to M15. We got 16 chunks. Now on these 16 chunks, perform these following 18 operations. Such as initialize 80 variables called W0 to W80. First 16 WI same as MI. So assign W0 as M0, W1 M1, W15 as M15. For remaining 64 operations, starting from I16 to 79, compute WI as WI minus 3 XOR with WI minus 8 XOR with WI minus 14 XOR with WI minus 16. And whole thing shift left rotate by 1. So this sign is left rotate by 1. So we'll use that sign different number places. So compute WI as this, WI minus 3, WI minus 8, WI minus 14. And since I is more than 16, this would work. For example, W16, we will have a W13, W8, W2, and W0. XOR all of them, rotate left 1 time, you get W16. Same way, compute W17 to W79. Having done that, start the next step. You repeat the following process 80 times, the 80 iterations. Compute delta, we have register R1, rotate left 5 times, plus apply a function fi. Fi is based on the iteration. Apply a function fi to register R2, R3, and R4, add register 5, add the wi which you computed, plus some constant ci. Again, the ci depends upon the iteration number. And then assign the registers as R5 becomes R4, R4 becomes R3, R3 becomes R2, rotate left 30 times. R2 becomes R1, and R1 becomes the computed value. This you are doing 80 times. Having done the 80 times, then you basically append all the R1s. So what are the function F1 and C1? Book only gives you the definition of function fi. Fi is given as, we have a 3 values, we said R2, R3, and R4. So given 3 variable ABC in the function, fi is computed as A intersection B union complement of A intersection C for I less than equal to 19. For I between 20 to 39, you simply do an XOR. For I 40 to 59, another operation, A intersection B union A intersection B union B intersection C. And then for iteration 60 to 79, again XOR. So depending on the iteration, you do different stuff. And this is given in the book. So this you have to probably remember and mug up. Constant CI is again defined in the same way. 4 different values. Again, book doesn't give this value, and you are not expected to remember the numbers. So you can say the initial value of registers and values of the constants are, use them as per standard. This is what the book says. After 80 iterations, we will get all these 5 register values. We'll get these 5 values. Once we get the 5 register, they keep on changing. So after applying this, and each register is 32-bit. If you look at each register is 32-bit. Append all the registers, concatenate with each other. 5 registers, each is 32-bit, total become 160-bit, and that is what you get the message digest. And that's how the SHA-1 algorithm works. So once we know the SHA-1 algorithm, we look at how these hash functions can be used with encryption to produce a digital signature that will give authentication. Now in the textbook, your digital signature part is very, very small. I don't even know what they can ask you in the question if it is really so small. So this is your SHA-1 function description, what is given in your book. And say constant is specified by standard, and similarly, they say RI as per the standards. If you look at initially, they say somewhere 5 register R1 through R3 of 20 bytes uses 5 register, doesn't say what the values are, but other thing I given you. And digital signature is a whole topic, that's all the book says. It's very, very superficial reading. But I'll get you more details, and I'll talk about mostly from content from textbook 1. So tomorrow we'll discuss digital signature, but understand SHA algorithm. Those who are interested can write their own program. It will be interesting to write a program and see how does SHA-1 really work to get a better understanding. So with that, I'm done for today. Any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, next class we'll discuss digital signature. If no questions, Thank you.